Have you ever played some games like Battlefield, Helldivers or Hearts of Iron 4 and thought something along the lines of, it would be delightful to fight the heathens in my D&D campaign? Well, I did, and from my experience you could run into some serious obstacles, because copying those pieces of media into tabletop RPGs is impossible. There are obviously multiple reasons as to why that is the case. However, they all revolve around one major one. The vast differences among different pieces of media. The prospect of exterminating seemingly endless swarms of bugs seems fantastic when you are playing a video game like Helldivers, while this same exact situation in D&D could terrify your players with the vision of 3 hours spent fighting those hordes, especially if you do not consider them as a swarm mechanically. I have to say that there are much better ways to execute fantasy Vietnam in ttrpgs. Anyway, welcome to Dungeon Hussars, where today I'll show you how to run war campaigns in D&D. Let me start by asking a really simple question. Why would you even want to run a war campaign for the ttrpg system of your choice? Well, you could have watched a movie, played a game or read a book that has its actions set during a war. However, if you want to run a good campaign centered around war themes, that unfortunately will not be enough. We need to consider why those art pieces are successful and why people will want to consume media related to war. First of all, war is an insanely good conflict generator all by itself. When a war breaks out and you either voluntarily or involuntarily declare support to one of its sides, the status quo is broken and the competition between powers escalates to the point where violence persists as the only viable option to resolve the conflict of interests. From the DM's perspective, a war campaign is a convenient tool which can be used to introduce more conflict, as the presence of a war impacts many aspects of life. Let's say, for example, that your players are conscripts who didn't want to fight in this war, but now they have to because of the fear of repercussions if they had tried to dodge it. So, we have our starting conflict, but thanks to the war's nature, new conflicts can be generated almost instantly as a consequence of the players, their superiors, or any other human's action. Wars, especially the modern ones, are insanely unpredictable, where even seemingly insignificant actions can lead to extreme consequences. Moreover, having a war campaign can also be an easy excuse to play with themes. A war effort is a perfect occasion to introduce some common themes that come with it, like propaganda, injustice, the hypocrisy of the government, and many others which can strengthen your overall campaign's story. Now that we have established why we will want to play war campaigns, we need to establish a tone for it. This is true not only for war campaigns, but for any campaign that you are going to run. The tone of your campaign will determine a huge amount of its aspects. The scenes that you are going to engage in, the encounters that your players will have to overcome, and the NPCs that the party will meet, as well as many more. While DMing a war campaign, there are a lot of tones to choose from. And even when you say to yourself, I'm going to make my campaign satirical, there's still a lot of tones to choose from, a lot of aspects to differentiate. Obviously, there is a difference between the satirical tone of Warhammer 40k and Helldivers. However, what is quite simple but also the most important thing to note is that not all tones will work well with all players. If your players love lighter tone campaigns and joke all the times, while you as a DM aspired to create this dark tone campaign set in the trench warfare inspired by World War I setting, then congratulations, you have created the deathcore of Crete.
Life could be a dream,
which might not be what you have aspired to create. Consulting the tone with your players will allow you to avoid the tone conflicts and create a motif that everyone agrees on. In July 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia upon Serbia's partial refusal of their ultimatum, caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This practice is known as Kasus Bell, which translates to occasion for war, and is basically required for any war, especially for wars in modern times when the citizens are probably much less willing to invade another country without any at least seemingly important reason. For a country that just invades another one because it has oil would be deemed expansive and a threat to the international security or the world order. Other oil-producing countries may feel threatened that this aggressive one will just invade them and take their oil. Casus Belli serves a role to justify the outbreak of a war and make it seem reasonable with things like, Our neighboring country is run by an authoritarian government, and we have to invade them to spread our beloved democracy. We can stop the war if the government resigns and another one is chosen according to the will of the oppressed people. However, as is the case with many other subjects, Casus Belli can both be the real reason why the sides are waging a war against one another, or it might be just an illusion created solely to serve the purpose of justifying the war to the nation's people, as well as to the international community. For your campaign, you should think about the Casus Belli and ask yourself, is this the true reason why the sides in my story are waging a war against each other? And if the answer is no, you have to create the real one. Of course, there may be many reasons as to why the war broke out, and you as a dungeon master should know all of them, because as your fantasy country is making war plans, you need to know what they're hoping to accomplish with them. Creating a casus belli for a war is just impossible to achieve on a satisfactory level if you're working on a blank sheet, because I believe that you could as of this moment just list a number of possible cases why the sides fight each other. However, you will be able to provide much better reasons for the conflict's escalation if you deeply nest them in your world building. We have a whole video dedicated solely to that subject, so if you would like to know more about it, click the link in the card. However, when you world build for a war campaign, you should really focus on detailing the sides that are waging a war. And I don't mean that you have to world build literally everything that's related to the war's sides, but only the part of the information that is relevant to your campaign. Focus on those parts that are actually connected to the main event. If the war is fought over economical reasons, answer the question whether they compete over a resource, a trade route, or maybe even a specific object, and justify the escalation, while also world-building the political relations between at least the two of the competing powers, as well as a bit of history. If they fight over ideology, focus more on establishing the internal politics and the society of each of the sides, etc., etc. You should also consider some natural boundaries that make waging a war in a certain terrain harder. After that, you also have to remember that in a fantasy world, geographical features will not be the only thing that plays a key role in shaping the course of a war. That's because of magic. Literally any military conflict, even if you play in a strictly medieval world that takes place in a fantasy world, would have a far grander scale than a one that was present during the adequate period in our normal one. Magic would basically arm those medieval armies with modern-day weapons, and provide them with capabilities that are unachievable even for our modern armies. For example, think about the Instant Fortress magic item. You can just tell one of the soldiers to throw it into the enemy formation, it will kill a lot of enemy soldiers, and then you also have another fortification on the battlefield. Or the Goodberry spell, that provides nutrition for an entire day for 10 people and is accessible for even level 1 druids. With this in its arsenal, an army may lead many units behind the enemy lines and stretch supply lines further than it would be normally possible. When planning a war campaign, you need to consider at least some consequences of the presence of the magic. While planning a war campaign, you should also consider the unpredictable nature of many large-scale conflicts. Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes that no one was expecting the civil war in Lebanon, its scale, duration, or consequences for the country. In 1914, the vast majority of not only soldiers, but also some of their commanders, actually believed that the war would end by Christmas. Here we wander into a huge player agency territory, because at some point we would like our players' actions to influence the course of the war, but this is something that you probably want to reserve for higher levels of your PCs. I will talk about this later in the video, but for now we have to note that wars are unpredictable, and you as a DM shall take that into account. Different operations can be stopped by different maneuvers and actions. So, in my opinion, you should simulate the operation that your players are being a part of, making their actions have an impact over the course of a battle. Something like destroying a bridge to cut their enemy's way of retreat, or defeat an enemy that is imposing a serious threat. But their actions should not have consequences on the whole operation, because if you give them the power fantasy immediately, it won't seem earned and it will bore them pretty fast. So, how do we make the actions of our PCs matter while not giving them the power fantasy immediately? Well, as I said, when you start a campaign, make sure that the actions of the PCs matter locally. They should be able to do really cool things that could, for example, make their officers award them with medals, promotions, or any other thing, while also applying consequences for their other actions. Have your PCs abandoned a fortification while not receiving an order to do so? Their superiors would most likely not let that act of cowardness go unpunished, and maybe send them to the region that is known for its insanely high casualties rate, or find another way to punish them. After your PCs go through the first stage of them being important locally, there are multiple ways that you can make their actions be remarkable and have a more widespread consequence. They can become a special forces and later elite forces unit, sent into the toughest battlefields to potentially change their outcomes. They can climb the ranks by commanding bigger units. In this case, you might have to change some combats to take place outside of the D&D system, bringing some wargaming to the table. And before you start yelling at me, "That isn't D&D!" we have to establish that at least I do not play D&D because I absolutely adore Dungeons and Dragons as a tabletop system, but to have a fun time with my friends. So, as long as you're all having fun, it's okay to change the rules so much that it might not even resemble D&D anymore. If you do not like it, you don't have to do it, but back to the video. You can make even a whole other campaign by not making your players the soldiers fighting on the front lines, but intelligence officers, diplomats trying to work out a peaceful solution to the conflicts after their initial failure in preventing the war. There are many roles that your players can fit into while playing a war campaign, but the most important thing to do is make their actions matter at least locally and then more broadly. Now you may ask yourself, how do I run encounters in a war campaign while most of them are huge battles? Well, we've already made a video solely focused on running battles in D&D. However, in summary, you would probably like to focus on smaller engagements, like defending a specific part of a wall from groups of enemies, destroying battle rams, and putting down skirmishes. While you as a DM should simulate the battlefield by maybe making one roll each time the players finish their turns, to see how the environment around them will change. And that's basically how to run war campaigns in D&D. Thank you so much for watching the video, I really hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, comment and subscribe to the channel if you did, and in order to not miss our future uploads. And for now, goodbye.